I'm sorry, but I wasn't able to finish this build in time, so this isn't the final reveal for my entry for the Say Cheese Group builds. I also had to split this update into 3 parts. I was sure that one video would have been way too long. This part is about the pigsty. The other 2 parts will deal with the hay wagon and the scratch-built wheelbarrows. I forgot to build a board that would serve as a stop for the door, so I did that after I released the build video. I split a coffee stirrer lengthwise and cut a piece to the appropriate length. Then it was glued into place and the build was finished. I must apologize for the use of beige paper as background. It wasn't the best choice, but I used it to work on. I take pics while I'm working and I need daylight to do this. That's why there are differences in lighting. Aluminum is a material that can be very difficult to handle when you want to paint it. I used Tamiya primer to turn the corrugated sheet metal into a surface I could work on. The primer was decanted and thinned with lacquer thinner. It was applied by paintbrush. The larger copper parts were primed the same way. All wooden parts and the underside of the roofs were airbrushed with Tamiya XF10 flat brown. I used a thinner I made from 60% alcohol and 40% water. The ratio was 1 part paint and 1 part thinner. The upper sides of the roofs were painted with Tamiya XF64 red brown. This color is perfect as a base for rust effects. Then I used Tamiya XF49 khaki for a misty layer on all parts except for the upper sides of the roofs. I sprayed it from a distance of about 10 to 15 centimeters. The flat brown is showing through lightly and makes for shadow areas.
Hey man, guess what?
What's that, Pops?
I met a chick.
Oh, yeah, what kind of chick?
Real chick.
A real chick?
Yeah.
How old is she?
16.
16?
Yeah.
Man, are you crazy?
No,
Listen to me.
Tell me something, man. I sure want to know.
Hey, boy, don't you harm that bird. Don't you dare to try. Start releasing that chicken or you'll get a licking. Chick's too young to fry. Say, boy, better take my word. Here's the reason why. Feed her steady till she gets ready. That chick's too young to fry. Take her back to the barnyard.
After all parts were dry, they were sealed for the weathering process with a flat clear coat.
The barnyard where she'll go up a better use. Hey boy, there'll come a time one day.
Then I applied my self-made dark wash onto all surfaces. I always use a flat clear coat instead of a glossy one. I know exactly how my washes work, where they accumulate and what they will look like after drying. A gloss coat isn't necessary for my way of weathering. In this case I didn't even remove any excess wash. I wanted this grimy look because my goal was to make the wood look very old and dry. As Bob Ross used to say, you need shadow in order to create light.
Just turn her loose way out there in the barnyard where she'll go up a better use. Hey boy, there'll come a time one day by and by. She'll be ready for fries and stop your crying. That chick's too young to fry. That chick's too young to fry.
You might think I'm a crazy fool, but I saw a horse doing the bobble with a mule down on the farm. Down on the farm. Down on the farm. Rock and roll taking over my barn. The rooster won't crow, chickens won't cluck. Walk around the barnyard doing the huckabug. Down on the farm. Down on the farm. Down on the farm. Rock and roll taking over.
Next step was to apply Tamiya XF57 buff with a sponge. It was used to represent damages and dried mud on the wooden areas. This was done before the dry brushing stages. I wanted to blend it with the light colors I used for the following steps. It may be unusual to do it in this order, but you'll see how it turned out at the end of the video. I used stippling and wiping motions to apply the paints and create different effects. Then I started the dry brushing process. First color I used was a mix of Tamiya XF2 white and XF49 khaki in equal portions. For the first run I always use a white brush with rather stiff nylon bristles. I work with some pressure, almost like scrubbing the surface. For the following steps I use softer brushes and less force. There's almost no paint at all on the bristles when I do this. If there are still wet areas on the brush, you ruin your previous work with clearly visible brush strokes. Actually, I don't like using acrylics for dry brushing. After removing all excess from the brush, the paint is almost too dry. I don't know why I started dry brushing with these acrylics. I knew before that it would cause problems. As you can see, there is some discoloration, but it would have looked way better if I had used enamels instead of acrylics. Enamels blend much better than acrylics. And as if that wasn't bad enough, I used a second acrylics mixture. This time it was Tamiya XF2 and XF52 Flat Earth, again in equal portions.
I can't get my milk in the morning. I can't get my cream no more. I can't get my milk in the morning. Can't get my cream no more. And I want somebody to come here, help me get this bull from my door. Says I went out to my barn this morning. He didn't have one word to say.
I don't know if you like the result or not, but I didn't like it at all. Something had to be done. I mixed Tamiya X19 smoke and my thinner. Then I sprayed it with low pressure. Corners and joints received more of the heavily diluted paint than the flat areas. That way I enhanced, or rather rescued, the shadows. Then I mixed XF57 as I did it with X19. The paint was sprayed on from a distance of about 20 to 25 centimeters. This way only the raised areas received the light to shade.
There is nothing that I could do for that old bull that she rolled me. There is nothing that I could do for that old bull that she rolled me. When I
I get myself another helper, I'm gonna move back to Tennessee. Says I'm still in love with my milk cow. I just can't stand the way she do. Says I'm still in love with my milk cow.
After all parts were dry, I continued the process with enamels. That worked much better because the brush's bristles didn't get sticky and too stiff to work with.
But please don't ballyhoo.
I will sing a little song, but it ain't very long, about a lazy farmer wouldn't hoe his corn, and why it was I never could tell, for that young man was always well. That young man was always well. He planted his corn on June the last. In July it was up to his eye. In September there came a big frost, and all that young man's corn was lost. All that young man's corn was lost. He started to the field and he got that last. The grass and the weeds was up to his chin. The grass and the weeds had grown.
A last run followed. I mixed a very light grey colour. Old unpainted wood has a light greyish appearance. It almost looks like silver.
Now his courtship had just begun, saying, young man, have you hoed your corn? I've tried in vain, but I don't believe I'll raise one grain. Don't believe I'll raise one grain. Why do you come to me to wed if you can't raise your own cornbread? Single I am and will remain, for lazy man I won't maintain. Lazy man I won't maintain. He hung his head and walked away, saying, kind miss, you rule the day that you was born. Forgive me the devil, cause I wouldn't hold my calm. Give me the devil, cause I wouldn't hold my calm. Now his courtship was to an end. On his way he then began, saying,
Time to add some rust to nails, bolts, lock handle and hinges. All these spots received a layer of diluted Tamiya XF10. The paint was almost transparent, so the base shines through. That way I already got some discoloration without applying any other color. There's a large area inside the sty where there'll be straw. I didn't care much for weathering that area because it won't be visible. Here you can see how the wood changed its appearance during the process of dry brushing. I guess that gives you an impression of how this old school way of weathering works. Another good example are these shadows. They are the result of dry brushing and they look quite natural and not like painted on. I thought it would be more and tedious work to paint all these bowls, but it actually only took a couple of minutes. Lock handle and hinges were the largest parts to paint. And then I realized that I had forgotten to paint the steel tubes inside the trough. I used heavily diluted Tamiya XF61 dark green. Again, I wanted the paint to be almost transparent. I used these two pencils for the steel effect on the rusty metal parts. You want to do this carefully and sparingly, not to go over the top. Too much of it wouldn't look good and realistic anymore.
Hey, man, guess what?
What's that, Pops?
I met a chick.
Oh, yeah, what kind of chick?
Real chick.
A real chick?
Yeah.
How old is she?
16.
16?
Yeah.
Man, are you crazy?
No, I'm-
Listen to me.
Tell me something, man. I sure want to know.
Hey, boy, don't you harm that bird. Don't you dare to try. Start releasing that chicken or you'll get a licking. Chick's too young to fry. Say, boy, better take my word. Here's the reason why. Feed her steady till she gets ready. That chick's too young to fry. Take her back to the barnyard.
Then the rust streaks followed. I did them with XF64. It's very important to avoid a uniform look of the streaks. There should be variations of length, width, and amount of paint.
Ready for frying, stop your crying. That chick's too young to fry. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Put her down, boy. Say it, little girl. Come here. How old are you? Get away from here. Too young to fry. Take her back to the barnyard. Let her go, just turn her loose. Way out there in the barnyard, where she'll grow up for better use. Hey, boy, there'll come a time.
I mixed some earth from the forest with lacquer thinner and brushed it onto the parts of the floor where there would be a lot of traffic of pigs around the trough. Next step was to mix some dark oil paints for the pin wash. It was applied around all metal parts and joints to enhance the shadows. Don't forget to use it beneath all parts. It can look too stark while it's still wet. It will blend in after the lighter fluid has evaporated and the oils have dried.
Down on the farm, down on the farm, down on the farm, rock and roll taking over my farm. Yeah. Rooster won't crow, chicken won't cluck, walking around the barnyard doing a huckabug. Down on the farm. Down on the farm, rock and roll taking over my barn.
Well, hello everybody everywhere.
Well, you can't see me, but I'm blinking at you anyhow.
I'm a farmer boy in a country kid. I'm a hillbilly, but I'm darn proud of it. You got your city folks moving in all around who ain't worth a darn when you get them out of town. They can't milk, can't even fish, can't do nothing but sit and wish. Always getting into some kind of harm. The world would be a better place if it was a farm.
The two parts of the roof should be a large area of rust. They were airbrushed with XF64, received a flat clear coat and a dark oil wash. The rest was done with ground pastel chalks. For the first layers I mixed the pastels with flat clear acrylic paint and brushed them on. The dark colors were used for the grooves and the light colors for the raised areas. I applied them randomly because rust doesn't look uniform. There were some larger bits of pastels in the mixtures, but I didn't notice them before I applied the paints. At first I wanted to remove these bits. Then I thought they might add to the realism, and so I didn't do anything about them. I liked the result, but I wanted to hear some opinions from fellow modelers. They said the large roof would look better than the small one. Then I tried to replicate the look of the large roof, but I failed. I wasn't able to remember how I achieved the rust effect on the large part. I worked on both parts at the same time and used all 4 colors with 4 brushes. Nonetheless, the results are different. A random result is very difficult, if not impossible, to replicate. I decided to airbrush both parts with heavily diluted X19. That had worked very well on the wooden parts, and so I hoped the same for the roof. And in fact, the parts looked more identically after the X19 had dried.
Get my milk in the morning. I can't get my cream no
They were a bit too dark now and they were a bit glossy, but now I started working with pastels again. I did all steps on all panels exactly the same way. The result wasn't very convincing in my eyes. Only the wash and the X19 helped in accentuating the panel lines. It was clear that I wasn't finished yet.
get this bull from my door. Says I went
I chose dark gray to enhance the shadows along the panel lines. The other 2 colors were used to lighten the raised areas.
Says I went out to my barn this morning. He didn't have one word to say.
It may be difficult to see because of the lighting, but now both roof parts look very similar. Similar enough to be happy with the result.
Then I walked away. And I hung my head and
The pastels look dusty now, but I'll seal them with a flat clear coat. That'll make them look a bit darker, but they'll still be light enough.
I hung my head and cried.
I bought 3 packages of sealing hemp a while ago. One package was colored in a yellowish paint mix to make it look like straw. As I mentioned before, there would be straw in the pigsty. I cut off pieces of 1.5 and 2 centimeters length.
But that old bull had
PVA glue was used to glue the straw into place.
there is nothing that I could do. But I
To secure the straw that had no contact to the floor, I used diluted PVA glue.
when I get myself another heifer, I'm gonna move back to Tennessee. Says I'm still
At that point I wasn't sure if I liked the way the straw looked.
I just can't stand
In the meantime I added some rust effects to the steel tubes inside the trough. I applied the 2 brown Tamiya paints randomly. I like the way that turned out. There won't be much visible, so that was just about enough. A trough and sows need food, so I mixed 6 different teas. The stuff was poured into the trough and then I spread some diluted PVA glue over it. The rosehip tea started bleeding, but that was fine. Back in the day, sows were fed the leftovers of the farmer's meal so the fodder could use some color. Food for pigs always contains a lot of water. The only stuff I have at home that could represent water is crystal clear window color. I didn't want to buy still water just for the trough. The bottle has a long spout with a diameter of only 1 millimeter. That made applying the window color easy. As you can see, it is white as long as it's wet. After drying thoroughly, it's transparent. It reminds me of PVA glue, and I think this is actually PVA glue. It's only thinner than the glue we use.
In September there came a big
Around the bottom of all wooden parts I applied different green pastels to represent moss. I started with the lightest green and then put on some black pigment on top. That was done because I wanted to retain the shadows in the wood grain. This is like reverse dry brushing. The last pigment you put on is the one that will be visible in the recessed areas.
The grass and the weeds had grown so high, called that poor man for to sigh, called that poor man for to sigh. Now his courtship had just begun, saying, young man, have you hold
The pot received some black pigment too, because the dirt I applied before destroyed the shadows.
Don't believe I'll raise one grain.
And then I went back to the straw inside the sty. I found it to be too flat, and so I cut off more of the yellow ceiling hemp. This time I used hairspray from a pump bottle to glue it into place. I applied it with a white soft brush. To break up the monotone yellow of the straw, I sprinkled bits of 2 different teas on top of it. The hairspray proved to be very useful for this job. I am happy with the result.
He hung his head and walked away, saying, kind miss, you rule the day you rule.
I added some more tea to the fodder. Now I'm content with it.
Give me the devil 'cause I wouldn't home a comb.
The sow also fits neatly into the sty.
And on his way he then began, saying, kind miss, I'll have another girl if I have to ramble this big wide world, if I have to ramble this big wide world.
This is what the sty looks like now.
Old MacDonald had a farm. E-I, E-I-O. Old MacDonald had a farm.
The larger roof won't be glued into place before I finished painting the sows and piglets. The flat clear coat on the roof is also still missing, but I put all pieces together for the pigs to give you an impression of the finished product. Hope to see you soon in parts 2 and 3.